I'm super excited about that service and how they're building it. Where the MVPs are here because we just had the MVP summit, and so it's super exciting to talk to actual project managers that I've been talking to is real in person, and I'm super excited about the stuff that they're building, they have built, and they're going to build. So here's what we're going to talk about: why did they build it? How does it work? What can you use it to do? And then when we don't have time, we'll talk about support. So just quick, like temperature of the room, like who's using Config Manager for software updates? Okay. Who's moved over to Intune? Okay, cool, good. So when I've discussed this content before, I presented when I've presented on the deployment service before, like I've been far more. Like, I think someday this kills WSUS. I think this someday kills on-prem software on-prem software management. And let's get into why, right? Like Windows Update. Here I'm talking about the cloud service. So now we all talk about cloud services and Scale and Azure and AWS and all those things. But like in my mind, the first cloud service that ever existed was Windows Update. Like it goes back to the late 90s, early 2000s. It's like, what is a global service that billions of devices are connecting to and interacting with and sending data to and from and then acting on that data? The first one I know about, feel free to call me out, provide another option, I think is Windows Update. And here's the thing, it's really mature and it's rock solid. Good, David isn't in the room, David Jamin is in the room. Can anybody remember Windows Update, the cloud service going down? Like being absolutely unavailable?
So I was part of the Windows sustenance engineering. We used to work on the Windows updates and the crit sets and everything. I know the story. So haven't seen it went down or something, but it was massive. Like I totally connect with your comment. It was the global cloud type service that time because it used to manage a lot of devices and it was, you have to connect to internet or somewhere, you get the package and you do whatever to get your Windows updated. Yeah.
Right. Now the update itself might fail. I can't speak to like the quality of the update that's getting installed, but the service that you interact with to get that update is rock solid. I can only think of one time in my career where it actually went down. It was returning like 500 or 503s, which just says it's too busy because somebody accidentally deployed some Delta update should have never made it into the catalog and that screwed it. So it's rock solid. And then over the time, right, like when it first came out, it was, if anyone remembers, like, was it 95 or XP days, you'd like go to the website, there's like a website to click on and go get updates. And down. And that was just OS, where we started with OS, and they were like, okay, well, what about Office and all the other first-party applications? Okay, that's kind of now in that cloud service. They've had firmware and drivers in there forever. Actually, I guess not forever, but there's like over like 1.5 billion drivers and firmware in the Windows Update catalog, right? So it's the hugest repository of that kind of stuff on the face of the planet. But this last one was the killer for all of us, right? There's no real meaningful enterprise control over Windows Update with cloud service. It has sure, maybe on your personal machine, you're just YOLOing out to the cloud, but like that's not a real management system or an enterprise, certainly not for servers. So it's an awesome service, but we really can't use it, or at least we historically have not been. Windows WSUS, like that's enough said. I've spoken for hours on WSUS. I will always say this. We all look at it as like this big thing of tech debt, and it's unfortunate it died on the vine, but like it solved, in its time, it was awesome. It solved the problems that we needed to solve in the early 2000s, right? When they sat down and architected this thing in 2000, they solved the problems that they had. We just don't have those problems anymore. So, and then they just didn't invest in it. So it's dead to me. So then they came out for Windows Update for Business, and this came out when Windows 10 was first being discussed and announced. I remember my boss went to Ignite. I didn't go to Ignite. My boss went to Ignite, and he came back and said, "Hey, there's this Windows Update for Business thing." It's like, "Oh, great. Okay, like now we have a replacement for WSUS, and all, like, great. This is going to be I'm so glad that somebody at Microsoft is thinking about this, how we solve this." And then when I looked at it, I was super disappointed because it's not a product. It's really just an extension of Windows 10, the OS, adding additional policies that you can control or feature and for quality and feature updates. You got deferral. So it's like, well, okay, that's, it's a minor evolution of the control we had before with Windows Update. Really, that's not enough for enterprises. It was introduced with Windows 10 Pro Enterprise or Education. It is configurable, like you can configure that with Config Manager, although I don't recommend anyone do that. Good thing he's out of the room. They're always way behind. So the Windows Update for Business is evolving all the time. They are actually still actively involved in it or in developing it. So like stick with group policy, or excuse me, Intune. Those are the two that actually keep up in terms of configuring Windows Update for Business. So at this point, I'm not tied with the deployment service yet. And so even with Windows Update for Business, like I said, that's not really a product. It's not really, it's an evolution of some controls we already had, a little more granular, but it's still not good enough. And so somebody at Microsoft, there was probably some room or rooms where they argued about this, and they came out with this idea, which is the Windows Update for Business Deployment Service. And what they wanted to build was, they wanted to build something that gave us the control we needed, right? So IT is in full control. You approve, you schedule, you monitor, all of those things happens in this service. They want it to be easy to adopt. It's programmable, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Like this, there's graph APIs. We'll not have time, but like I have a whole PowerShell script where you can, everything we talk about today, all of those features of the Windows Update Deployment Service, you can go write PowerShell yourself and do everything we're doing today without using any Intune or anything else. It has all sorts of privacy compliance. Good thing that Jordan's out of the room, otherwise he'd go ape about all these compliance things. Intune is the flagship experience. And this is super key to think about when we talk about the deployment service. And we'll see if we, is that next? No. What it is related to this is that the deployment service sits under it is a cloud, it is an API around the Windows Update cloud service. That's the way to think about the deployment service. So it's not tied to Intune. You don't need Intune licenses to use it. And that's also why it's tied to the Windows 10 license. And so the license requirements, which we'll get into later, it's tied to Windows 10 because that's how it's funded. That's where it sits in the org now. And yes, Intune is the way 98% of all of us will probably integrate with that service, but that's a matter of practicality, not a technological architecture. And so yes, Intune, but there's other MDMs. If anyone is using Workspace ONE or know anyone who is, they too. I have a good friend that does consulting in there. Yes, they are also using the deployment service. You can use PowerShell. You can create reporting on this. You can do workbooks and query the Graph API and build these things. You can build bots. So I'm going to talk at MMS about this in the deployment service in deep detail. And she's actually written a Teams bot that would like interact with the deployment service and tell you, hey, like you have a device that failed, right? Because it's totally programmable. And so you can create things if you want for help desk, for your ticketing automation systems or whatever. Like, hey, this machine isn't patched. Like I said, just go make a ticket and service now, whatever you want to do. It really is an API around the Windows Update and that cloud service. That's what gets me so excited about it. So here's some of the requirements that I've mentioned. You have to be Azure AD joined. That can include hybrid. Nobody cares. The thing is, it is device-based, and this is a thing that sometimes people struggle with when I talk about the deployment service, is that it has no concept of user. That is purely a artificial other thing that are called into that service. So the deployment service is tied to an Azure AD computer ID or device ID, whatever the proper name is, and if anybody wants to correct me, go for it. But it's tied to those things. So if you have to have that ID in Azure AD, I don't care how you get it, whether it's hybrid or whatever, it has to exist. Because when programmatically you call into the deployment service, those are the things, that's what it's going to be all based on that hardware ID. Also, by the way, just stop me in the middle. Question, I'm trying to go fast because we got 60 minutes or I have to pay you a bunch of money. And I'm cheap. So supported OSs, yeah, Windows 10. It's basically any supported version, Windows 10 or 11. Licensing, right? This is what I was alluding to earlier, E3 or E5 or A3 or A5, that's your education, or business premium. Again, this is a service that somebody has to pay for. Even Microsoft charges themselves to run their own services. So somebody has to pay for it, which means we have to pay for it somehow. And the answer to that is it's Windows licensing. So that's why it's not going to be available in lower licensing, because somebody needs to pay for that service to run. There's a graph query here. I presume we'll be able to post these slides somewhere. But you can go run this graph query in your tenant. And if you see Windows Update for Business Deployment Service, that means you're good. right? That means that your tenant is onboarded for this deployment service and you can now use it. The other requirement here is you need to give telemetry. So in order for any of this to work, especially for reporting, just yell out. Yes.
Quick thing doesn't impact me, but a lot of people in here, do they do G3, G5 as well for like government customers yet?
Great question.
That's
That I don't-
G3 and G5. You mean
Yeah.
government customers? Yeah. So the license are like little bit on, that's called GCC cloud,
Right.
government community cloud. And the idea is some of the government customers, they want to have their tenants custom and with the compliance. So I think whatever you are seeing, so the government versions are G3 and G5.
And they lag behind.
They lag behind, and there is a reason behind that, because commercial features, they go faster. But when we talk about government, they have to go some specific compliance programs. We have to make sure. So that's the reason it goes behind. I'm part of some of that kind of area, and I see customers, they ask about, okay, this feature is not available in government tenant. Why do that? So I tell the same reason, because it has to go through specific compliance checklists.
But this is also in G3, G5.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Now, having worked with government directly myself a lot, I hadn't heard that G3, G5, but I do know it's GCC. Like,
and then I'll just little bit of double check on that, on this specific feature, what is the status? But if you have to search somewhere, it will be G3 or G5.
So you do need to configure the device to give you, you need at least required telemetry or more. And you also need to enable allow WUfB cloud processing. As I understand, when you onboard, that most of that stuff should happen, but just make sure you're not doing the opposite, right? Make sure you're not turning telemetry off or those kind of things. If you do, it's not going to go well for you. So let's talk about how this thing actually works, because this is where I actually got the most excited. So forget this for a second. Well, let's talk about this. This is how we normally think of, like in config manager, a lot of some of what Johan was talking about. Like this is what we think of normal management. You have an MDM that's pushing policies down to the devices, and those devices act on those policies when they talk to Windows Update, right? There's nothing here. You're talking to the devices are talking Windows Update. And about 4 years ago, now maybe only 3, I saw this slide, and I got super excited because what had happened is Microsoft was doing a private preview of a feature update deployment, or what we now call feature update policies, right? We'll talk about that feature in a second. And as an MVP, I was doing the private preview, and it just didn't work. Like straight out, was not working. And so I was talking to the project manager, like, "Hey, this isn't working." He got me an engineer, and I was like, "Okay, well, like, just show me where's the log, right? Where's the log on the device that I look at, or where's the registry key that I figure out like what build of Windows 10 is supposed to be there?" And he's like, "Well, it's not there." Like, "Well, what do you mean it's not there?" He's like, "There's nothing on the device." It's like, there has to be a policy on the device that tells you what to do. He's like, "No, there's not." It's like, "Well, then how? How is that working?" He's like, "Well, there's a single DSS." It's like, "Well, what is that? I don't want to talk about it." It's like, "No, we're going to talk about it." We're going to talk about it. And so it was either David Mabane or David Guerre, I forget which. But he finally showed me this thing. And I don't care, at that point again, we're only talking about feature update. Like that's all we were talking about. But I saw this and I'm like, holy shit, that's awesome. Because somebody wrote an API in front of this cloud service that earlier I was talking about how much I love and how it's rock solid and how it has all this content and it's just unusable for enterprises. But then somebody thought, well, instead of building better this or putting WSUS in between there, why don't we just actually build an API that talks directly to Windows Update? And so if nothing else we talk about today, this is the slide that gets me super excited because it's the right solution for Microsoft in terms of how do we use this awesome cloud service, which is Windows Update, but make it programmable and usable, not just for Intune, but for anyone who wants to do things in that space. And so, here's a slightly deeper on how things work. So you have a commercial device, right? You're enrolled into Intune, you have Azure AD, and it's going to start talking to the deployment service. Windows Update will start sending data to the deployment service. And that's, wait a minute, commercial devices, they start scanning from Windows Update. That telemetry gets sent up to Microsoft, and then the deployment service here starts you're grabbing all of that stuff together. So it knows the scan status of your devices. And then over here, you're using something, right? Now in here, it's Intune, but it could be Graph, which you can do via PowerShell. You can write all of those things yourself. And there's some, there's some admin over here using that to tell the DS what to do. And the DS now here doesn't send policy to the device, it sends policy to Windows Update. And this is the part that really gets me excited, that you have an administrator talking to an API that's talking to Windows Update. And the client isn't involved at all, right? So if your client goes bad, there is no client involved. So if your client goes bad or it's offline or whatever it is, doesn't matter because it's not involved until it starts talking to Windows Update. As long as it can talk to the networks, that's rock solid. And in my experience, it's only gone down one in my career. It will get whatever it is you tell it to do.
Oh, I didn't know that was an animation.
Yeah, so right, all of that stuff is in the cloud. And so the only two parts that aren't are that and that. Brief thing, I don't actually want to talk about the slide a whole lot. The top and the bottom are the most important things. Don't cross the streams. If you're going to configure a device, don't try to mix and match things. Pick one and go with it. Otherwise, you will create problems for yourself. Generally speaking, because of the way that architecture works, right? Like if you try to do something that does policy on the device, but then you mix that with like the DS doing something, here in Windows Update, like this is going to win because Windows Update just won't offer it, right? Because what you're doing is telling Windows Update what should I or should I not offer to this device and when, and the device doesn't know about that. And so, generally speaking, the Windows Update deployment service will win any conflicts you decide to create for yourself. The only difference here is pause. So if you go into Windows Update for Business, you say, hey, we're going to pause updates. That does tell the client, hey, for a while, we're going to stop taking updates. So that will supersede anything you do in the deployment service. So let's talk, everything we talked about is what this thing is and what we can, how it works. Are there any questions on that before we kind of dive into some of the features? The features I think most of you have seen, but the drivers and firmware, hopefully we can dive a little bit into if we have time. Yes.
This may be an oversimplification, but I mean, is the deployment service a database of Azure AD IDs, which then have almost policies applied to those AAD IDs so that, like we send the policy from Intune and it says, this AAD ID is only allowed to get feature update Windows 10 22H2. I mean, is it like a database that just has Azure, this AAD ID and what, and a policy for that? Is that?
Yeah, so exactly. So Intune, right? Right. When you look at it, is an abstraction layer.
Right.
Right. That's telling data. At the end of the day, in here, you can, trying to be technically correct here for a second. So, and this is going to get a little complicated, but the deployment surface itself has something called an audience. So, we're all familiar with either collections or groups in either Azure Active Directory or whatever it is, what we call the same thing in Intune. The deployment service has its own concept of groups, which are just completely disassociated from every other group we've ever talked about, right? So it's a hidden mechanism. And so it creates this list of groups and then it's deploying things to that group. And then what the deployment service does, there's actually something called DCAT that's actually, this is a service, the API is called DCAT, which then talks to something else, I think. But here it is a one-to-one. Ultimately, you're saying like this device ID gets this version of Windows 10. That is you think of it in database terms, like, I don't know this, I'm not saying this is technically how it works, but in like, as a mental framework, it's like, no, it always boils down to this device gets this done. Right. All right. I don't know who knows better than I do, most people. Any other questions about how this thing works? Okay. So what can we do with it? I'm sure at this point, almost all of you are familiar with feature update deployments, which is you can basically pin the version of Windows on the device to a specific version. And when we're all done, we'll do all the talking, then we can go do some demos and I can show you how it looks like. But I suspect like who you here has already created a feature update deployment in Intune. Okay, right. Very specifically, it was for a while the only way to go to Windows 11. That's no longer the case. You can do that with straight Windows Update for Business now. But the very key thing here is that, you're going to pick a specific Windows release and that's where it's going to stay at. We were talking about, that mental framework of like, it is a row, right? There's a row of saying this device, this Azure AD device ID is going to get this build or release of Windows 10. That's how it's working. You can select when to make it available. You have options there, right? There is a gradual rollout. We'll talk about that. It's a separate sort of feature within the deployment service. Or you can do it right away, or you can pick a specific date. Now, the idea there is you can create your own rollout rings, right? So if you say, hey, we're going to create what is auto patch called? We'll talk about auto patch when we have time too. They call it like test, pilot, fast, and slow or something like that. Butchering that is something different. But like you can create your own ring. The idea here is you can create your own rings. Whatever rollout strategy you need for a feature update, you go do that once. Make all those rings, make the groups, put them up there. And then all you need to do is as you release versions of Windows 10 or 11, you just go in there and say, hey, this group is now ready for this, right? So we're ready to move this, the test group to Windows 11. And you go do that. And then you wait. And then when you're ready, you can go to the next group. That's the kind of thing you can do. If you want to get more, well, we'll talk about, when we talk about gradual rollout, within those groups, if you want to like slow that roll and not just do it big bang to that, 100,000 devices, that's what gradual rollout is. We'll go there in a second. You assign it to Azure AD groups. Again, that group is going to go there and stay there forever. Today, it will never leave. There's actually, so if you decide to run an end of life version of Windows 10, it's going to stick there today. They're actually having discussions. If anyone follows Arya Carly or Arya Updated on Twitter, she had a recent thread like, what should Microsoft do because we're letting people pick and not update. Like, what do we do when they've picked something that's end of life? Today, nothing will happen. That device will stay at end of life. And that might be like, I can argue both sides of that argument. One is like, hey, no, the administrator has this intent and maybe there's a reason they can't be off that version, but also they're running an insecure version of Windows 10. That seems like bad, or that seems bad. Like the tool probably shouldn't let them do that. I don't know. I'm of two minds. I can argue the other way. So by all means, go get rid of that kind of feedback because I'd be interested. I'm interested to know myself. So I alluded to it a little bit earlier. So this was like the second thing they released. So the first thing they built on this API was feature update deployments. And I was like, that makes sense. That was absolutely good. Go back 3 years. That was sort of the biggest problem with Windows Update for Business is, I could only delay feature updates. That's all I could do. I could never pick a specific version. No, did anybody in this room actually release 3 versions of Windows 10 across their entire environment every single year, ever? Yeah, right, nobody did that. And so and that's all you could do in Windows Update for Business. The deployment service solves that problem. So actually the right problem to solve first. Okay, what's next? Well, as we all know, creating rings sucks. It's really hard to how you roll out and how to do your testing always sucks. It's horrible. We've all had the experience of where we set our deployment rings, whether it's 2 rings or 3 rings or 5 rings, and we all go through it. We might find some issue, and then you hit that last rollout where you do your 90%, and you always find a problem there, right? Making rings is the right thing to do, but it sucks, and we always find issues when we finally do final prod rollout. Part of what this does, and if you gradual rollout, is saying, okay, well, instead of just the rings where it's, hey, I got a ring of 90%, my last ring is 90%, and then that's just a single day. Everyone in that ring just big bang goes out, and now they're going to move up to Windows 10. Maybe that's not the right thing for you. Those rings make sense, right? Like, hey, the way that you want to roll this out to the groups of devices makes sense, but you don't want those individual groups to all go at the same time, immediately. And that's what gradual rollout will do for you. So you can spend, the idea is you generally give a start and end date, right? So we say, hey, this larger group of devices I have that are ready to take this build of Windows 10 or 11, I want them to start on this date. And then I want them to be done by this date. And then what it will go to, and then I want this many days in between each of those groups for myself to sort of evaluate and make sure that that's going okay. And on here, it's basically a screen test, right? Are things going horrible that we need to stop this rollout? And so you put those things in, and then the service just randomly assigns those devices into equal groups and sizes based on the start, end date, and how many days you want between those groups. And it goes does all of those things. Now, anytime you tell some people, anytime you tell me or this group, like, hey, we're going to randomly put devices in a group, that creates a certain amount of like concern. But the thing is, this isn't intended to replace your deployment rings, right? You still want deployment rings. So if you want to do your piloting and your testing and your slow roll like that, you're still going to do. You're still going to have 4 or 5, whatever rings you need. But it's only within those rings, if you want to slow that roll a bit, just to make sure they all don't go. That's where you use gradual rollout. So I don't see gradual rollout being used for hey, I have 1 ring and it's gradual rollout. I just roll it out to anything. So that's why the randomization doesn't matter. Because you're the one already deciding what devices these go. You're the one responsible for making sure that the right devices are in those groups, right, in your rollout plan. It's just within that, do you really care, right? If you need to spread that out, do you care about which ones it is? I would say no, don't care. If you do care, make sure you got the right rings. Then you have a ring problem, not a rollout problem. There is some talk about like, and we had it this week, like, how do we make that a little more intelligent, right? That randomization kind of sucks. And there's also, like I said, how do you create those rings? It's hard. It's hard to create good patching rings, right? Who should be in the first, who needs to be in those first rings? Well, it's probably a matter of like hardware, who's got what hardware and what apps, right? It's a very difficult thing for humans to solve individually, but taking all the data and doing it. There's some discussion of like, hey, if you enable cloud processing, they're going to get some telemetry and they're going to try and help create some intelligent rings for you. I don't know that that's happening today, but they've stated like that's where they want to go. And I've already talked about this, right? Creating rings to rings. This is what you've got to think of with gradual rollout. You're not creating, you're not getting rid of rings. You're taking rings and making rings of rings. Okay, enough about gradual rollout. Let's talk about expedite updates. So again, if you think about the way I'm presenting this is the way in which they introduce these features, right? So, okay, maybe I could switch these two, but like feature update deployments, absolutely, that's number 1. Oh, it's the second thing we go at? Maybe it was expedite, but they went with gradual, that's fine. But the next big thing is like, well, what happens when my security department comes to me and says, we don't care about a normal testing plan, we don't care about any of that stuff. We are literally crapping ourselves right now. We want you to push this thing out as fast as you humanly can. Another huge problem in everything, really, every technology we have at Microsoft for patching has this issue, right? How can I literally go as fast as humanly possible? And that's what they've done in expedite. Now, this wasn't it's sorry, just having internal debate. Expedite, what it tried to do is obviously do this faster. And it's doing that by just completely avoiding all your normal update process, right? So you have those rings. Nope, rings are gone. Everyone in one to right now. You probably have some like user experience configurations, like, hey, how long do I give them to reboot? Do I give them messaging? None of that happens. Okay, you've decided to expedite. None of that's going to happen. They will get a notice, I believe, that you are going to reboot in this time, and it's going to happen. Okay, so there's some people say, well, why wouldn't I just expedite it all the time, right? Who doesn't want to patch fast? It's like, well, it's not hard to patch fast. You just get fired for doing it, right? Like I say this, like patching isn't, patching is easy. Rebooting is hard. And so, no, you don't want to do this all the time unless you hate. I mean, here's the thing: like, you wouldn't need, if you wanted to expedite updates, you just configure a crappy user experience, and you'll get exactly this in an automated fashion, right? So I've literally heard people saying, "Hey, I want to automate this every month, so we expedite every update." It's like, well, why? You could do that today without this feature. So this is really specific for when you have those kinds of security moments where they're very concerned. And a couple of things they added, initially started with quality, but this is where this is great. They've added the out of band updates. And I know there's discussion. I don't know if it's there today, but talking about adding those preview updates. And so preview updates are like the week. So we call Patch Tuesday. That's week B in Microsoft parlance. That's the second Tuesday of the month. And then they release preview, and those previews include quality updates. So every once in a while, okay, more often than anyone would like, but often you will have a quality issue. Like, anybody remember when all their printers stopped working? Okay, David, nodding.
What's a printer?
So, yeah, like, what's that? What's a printer? Okay. It's a fair point. Point made.
I try to block out traumatic memories.
Exactly. Printing itself is a failure, I understand. But, you know, that's not a security issue, that's a quality issue, and it impacts you. And if you know, there's some ones that were worse than, that I can remember that are worse than printing, you know, literally breaking devices and so on and so forth. And so at some point, we will be able to, I know they're working on it, talk about it, so there's NDA. That, you know, we can, the ability to expedite those things out. So again, everything I kind of said, right, it's all about just aggressively pushing those things out. It's going to ignore all your deferrals. It's going to transiently override your reboot settings. You know, all they're going to see is a prompt, and they don't have a choice in here. The thing I would add here is if you've never expedited ever once, I'd suggest go doing it today. Now, you expedite like the oldest update you're already certain is in your environment. Because when you expedite an update, it's expedited to a specific point in time, or to a specific build of Windows 10, or a specific cumulative update. And so as long as the device already has that, or something greater, then it doesn't matter. The expedite won't do anything. But here's the problem you could find yourself in, is that you actually, the expedite process takes the device to be, it has to get enrolled in that process. It has to get enrolled in the expedite service, or the deployment service in general. There's an enrollment process there. And so with the day, if you wait to the day that the security department comes down and says, we want you to deploy right now, and you go do it, now you will wait 24, 48, 36 hours for that to happen. And I remember when that printer nightmare or whatever printer one, that was an experience a lot of people went through, like, hey, we're expediting, but it's not working. It's like, no, it's working. It's just going to take 3 days to get in there, which that's kind of defeats the purpose. So if you go expedite an update now that you already know is well and deployed, you'll be ready for the next one. You actually have to use this service. Drivers and firmware. So this is, again, think of, you know, this is how they released it, but like, okay, now you've done those two things, you've got expedite, what's next? What's the next thing that enterprises really have difficulty controlling? And yet Windows Update is this awesome repository for it. Plus drivers and firmware. Again, for over a decade now, I think, we've had drivers and firmware being up there. There's over 1.5 billion drivers and firmware in Windows Update, but there's just no API in front of it. There's no way to control it, right? So very, very few people are willing to just YOLO out drivers to their enterprise and just hope that it doesn't create issues. Like nobody's going to do that, even though it is a feature in Windows Update for Business. I don't know anybody using it. Anybody using Windows Update for Business to just deliver, sorry, Windows Update for Business to deliver drivers without any.
I have mostly Surface devices, so.
All right, there's the guy. There's always that guy.
I have no choice.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Okay, yeah, good point. So yeah, I don't know, I now know one person. That's nice. That's better than zero. And so it's this great repository, but just lacks control. And so, well, now we have an API. Let's go build a solution for that. So it allows you to detect, report, and deploy firmware and drivers. So it's not, again, it's 1.5 billion. So what you don't get to do is say, hey, I want to deploy this drive. You know, they're not going to have you search 1.5 billion drivers. And let me tell you, you might say, I want that. You do not, because the metadata in there isn't what you think it is. Like, if you're looking for this specific version of this driver, like that is a needle in a haystack, and the name is, I can't read that, Kim. Well, I can't read, but I definitely can't read that. So you have an option here to automatically or manually deploy updates. If you automate that, you can do rings again, right? So you can have a deferral. So you can set up like 3 or 4, whatever you want. Say, hey, we're going to automatically deploy any update that gets detected as needed in my environment. Or sorry, I say update firmware or driver update in my environment. We'll deploy that to the small group, and as long as that goes well, we'll do the next group. Right? So you can create these rings for your driver deferrals. So that's the automatic. I don't know too many people doing automatic because that just sounds scary. I mean, it sounds like we're back to the scenario I talked earlier, but it isn't quite that, right? It isn't, again, it's not your whole environment. We're just going to wait 3 days after release and deploy it. Like that's not much of a value add. And so again, you would create rings in that scenario. Or the option is just to manually do it. And again, we're not giving you 1.5 billion drivers and firmware to select. It's going to just give you the list that's applicable to your set of devices. And then you can also, you can push stop, right? So if you create those rings or even manual deployments and you start hearing issues, you can go and you can suspend it. And again, because it's all working, all of this stuff works really fast most of the time. And what I mean that's because you're not waiting for your 100 or your tens or hundreds of thousands of devices to check it and get policy. It's just in the background talking to Windows Update. But the Windows Update, that service, which is always up and never fails. And so we get to do a demo, which you'll be amazed at how fast that can work. What drivers and firmware are included? Honestly, it's anything an OEM or independent hardware vendor. So OEM would be HP, Lenovo, or Dell. That's where a ISV, independent hardware vendor, would be Intel or Broadcom, the people that are actually making the physical parts that an OEM puts into a device that they sell us. It's still just Windows Update behind the scene, right? So again, this process has been going on for a long time of those people submitting drivers into Windows Update, right? So that's nothing new. Microsoft thoroughly tests and flags the drivers. Have quotation marks. And what that sort of looks like is, when it gets submitted by the OEM or ISV, they will run a whole bunch of kind of security tests, right? There's a whole bunch of just, hey, does this look bad to us, right? And there's lots of solutions to that. They won't tell me, even me, what those solutions are, but they're trying to go throw anything they can at this to make sure it doesn't have a virus or whatever. There's times when certain drivers may have had a keylogger. I won't mention who. And they've learned from that. So they also try to learn from those kind of mistakes. Like, oh, this is a behavior of a driver that's bad. And so they're trying to build that statement in. So the moment that one of these OEM or ISV submits a driver, they're doing some automated tests. And that happens fairly quickly. We're talking hours, not days or weeks. And then it gets signed and pushed into Windows Update or WUfB. Now, at that point, you wouldn't see it. If you just have your device connected to WUfB, you wouldn't actually see it. Yes, it's there, but no, you wouldn't. It's hidden from you until it goes through another flighting process. So Microsoft will flight it internally. They'll install that driver. But if they don't have the hardware, then they start going outside. So if you're in the Windows Insiders, you can actually sign up to test drivers. And they'll publish that and they'll flight it. And they'll try to get telemetry back. And that can take longer, right? It can take 14 to 30 days. So that's why you sometimes think, oh, it takes a long time. But if you're using the deployment service, it goes quicker. So in theory, in the design, I don't know that I haven't been able to test this in practice yet, but in theory, the moment that those automated processes happens, which again takes, we're talking hours, not days or weeks. The moment it's in there, it'll show up in the deployment, the drivers and firmware deployment service. But it's not going to show up as recommended. It's going to show up as another driver. So it will never be automatically deployed to your environment. But if you had an issue where you have a driver that's either has a major quality issue or has a vulnerability, you're very, very concerned about it, and you're like, well, I can't wait 30 days. Right? I can't wait for 30 days for Microsoft, to flight this thing, and they're certain of it. Well, in theory, the OEM or ISV has thoroughly tested it themselves, and so they're going to give you the opportunity to then yourself do your own testing. Right? They're going to presume you're in an enterprise. You can create your own testing rings to decide how fast you want to go. But you can go faster than the general consumer Windows Update will. So again, once the ISV or OEM submits it, within hours or a day, you should be able to start deploying that in your environment. So for those vulnerability and critical zero-day issues, you'll get it faster than everywhere else.
Yeah, Brian, I have something to add here. So on the drivers issue, so I was part of the sustenance engineering driver team. Like we used to deal with store port and SCSI port drivers, and it needs hardware. So
SCSI port?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Yes.
And you might talk about iSCSI if that is still valid, like SAN or whatnot. But anyway, so we can talk about that later. But one of the reasons this driver.
How many years in do we need to be before we talk?
Yeah, exactly. So the reasons sometimes this driver updates specific to ISVs come late because we had a team and we had a repro lab to reproduce the issue, which was extremely difficult. So once we could reproduce the issue, then the developers or the like team could work on the resolution. Like we used to do kernel debugging and getting the exactly the bug check issues and whatnot. But it used to take a lot of time. Most of the time we wouldn't be able to reproduce. So that is the reason sometimes those specific driver updates, they were out of band. It was not with the main release because we did not know about it. But we try to help with some of the customers, like big customers, any ISV customers, if they have, just to create some quick patch or quick fix about that. But just wanted to highlight that was one of the reasons this driver updates specific to problem, it came a little later.
Yeah, it's understandable, right? That especially Microsoft, if through different parts of Microsoft, I understand that they take it seriously, that they take content from some third party and then deploy it to all of us, right? Like they take that responsibility very, very seriously. And so without, in terms of, again, taking a driver and giving it to the whole world all at once, like they take that very seriously. That's why they cannot go fast as we may want. But that's why I have this line on. That's why, again, I get excited about the service, because what they're saying here is, hey, you get to choose if you want to deploy this. Like they're never going to do it automatically for you in this stage of the process. But if you absolutely need it, you can get it faster through this process. Any questions about that? Yes.
You may get to this later, but can you roll back a driver?
No, there's no driver uninstalled.
So once you get a bad driver, you can only go forward, you can't go backward.
Correct. So it's a great question.
Client side, you could handle it, but you can't service side.
Right. No, because I had an Ethernet driver, let's just say, that had a blow.
You can manually fix it.
Yeah, I guess I could then pause it, because the problem was I would manually fix it, then it'd go, hey, there's a new one, and then update it.
Right. That's the problem, right? Again, you're setting a policy in Windows Update that says this is the best driver. So if you manually roll it back, that's great. But then you're going to do the scan. It's kind of like, hey, there's a new driver. Well, we should go ahead and install it. Right? We're not doing driver, we're not doing driver pinning here. We're installing a driver. There is no uninstall process today for that.
You can't pin an older version, even if it didn't uninstall it. But then you can manually uninstall it.
So what you could do is here's what you can do. There is no uninstall, and that is the correct answer for yourself. But you're asking, well, can you manually uninstall it? So you're right, Dave. Of course, you can uninstall. You can manually roll that device back. But what you want to do is then go change your deployment. Right? You'd want to undeploy the one that's broken, and you want to go deploy the one that
And then manually clean it up.
And here's the thing. Again, this is only 60 minutes. And we have time, I can show you the demo. But like when it reports those drivers, there's two levels. There's, right here. Sorry, I'm literally segueing into my own content. Way to go, Brian. The driver that Windows deems best is the recommended update. So there's two in the deployment service, or in the deployment service, there's two categories of drivers. Every driver that's applicable to the device should show up in the service, and it should show up in the UI. But it's going to split it into two categories, recommended and other. Recommended is, the one they deem is best. Right? So, and we don't have time to, I think I have a slide in to talk briefly about what best means, but that's its own like long drawn out conversation that we'll have at MMS if you want to go have that. Everyone that's not best shows an optional. So if you think of it in terms of like versioning, right? And the latest driver should always show up in recommended. N-1 and 2 and 3 and 4, all those older drivers, they should still appear. They're just going to show up in other. So to David's point, you find out that you deployed a driver. Yes, you can't automatically uninstall it, but you could stop installing the new one, and you could make sure you're installing the old one and then go fix the problem. And then the deployment service won't go ahead and recreate that problem for you. Something worth noting that vendors control the publishing, not the selection, right? So when a vendor admits it, they do have some, we're going to talk about in a second, but like, they're just publishing it too. And it's up to Microsoft to decide how to figure out how to apply that driver to the endpoint. No, I didn't. Okay, sorry. We don't have a slide on that. So actually, after this week, again, this isn't, you go look up something called a CHID. It's a computer hardware ID, something. I'd never heard of it until like a week or a week and a half ago. And it actually kind of makes this last line a lie. Vendors can actually provide a CHID. You can actually see the CHID on the driver. So everyone here is probably familiar with, if you've done drivers, you're familiar with the INF and the hardware IDs and like that. Everyone, we're used to that. But there's this other concept that isn't in that INF. It's not in anything you'll get to see. If you want to, and what it is, it's this, like, I'm pointing, you can't see it because it's in here, but like this specific model of device has a chip. And it's tied to it goes down to the base model of the, like, motherboard. Doesn't go lower than that. So it's not about the device. It's not about the NIC. It's not about the hard drive. It's not about the RAM. It's not about the actual individual device that the driver applies to. The chip applies to this device, which is a Dell XPS 17, what, G something? What is it? 15, thank you. But what's G what? 2 or 3 or 4, I don't know. But like, it's that level, right? And they can, and when the OEM publish a driver, they can say, hey, this driver, yes, it has all these hardware IDs, but it's specific to this model of device. And so I actually was corrected. I'm sorry, I didn't correct that when I reviewed this. But they actually do have the ability now to control, to make sure that Dell drivers show up on Dell devices. Because if you've ever done this for long, you know that they all share those components, right? You have IHVs, they're the ones that make the actual parts that an OEM then puts together and packages and sells you as an actual device. And both of those will publish updates publish drivers and firmware into Windows Update, right? So they both exist there. But the OEMs have the ability to say, hey, this driver, and again, it's more technical. We'll dive into it at MMS if you want to come to that session. But like the OEMs have the ability to say, yes, this driver, it applies to all of these hardware IDs, but this is the model that this driver is intended for. Do not install it anywhere else. And that will always take precedence over the hardware ID. If there's a CHID, that kind of targeting, that always takes precedence.
Can you override the CHID?
No, you cannot. You cannot.
Because let me give you the scenario. So I have a device, let's say it's 5 years old. The OEM says, we're not going to support it anymore, but the IHV is still putting out new drivers. Can I say I want the latest IHV driver or even a CHID from a different, HP is still supporting this particular, chipset, but Dell isn't. Can I grab the HP driver, push it to my Dell, because it's a newer fixed driver,
So a couple things on that. It's a great question. And so the question there, just to make sure everyone heard it, right? If a device goes end of support by the OEM, but there's another OEM, like I can still get new drivers for this, can I sort of hack around that in here? And the answer is probably no. And the reason for that is once a device has a driver that is targeted with a CHID, it will never, ever, ever go to a non-CHID driver. Okay, so even if, so let me give an example, right? So Dell delivers a driver for this specific model, and then they decide they're done, but Intel publishes new drivers for a piece of, for the CPU or whatever is on here. It will never, ever apply that because Intel should never have a chip because they don't do, right? They don't,
They mostly don't.
Somebody's gonna be like, well,
They do make nuts, but.
Exactly. Okay. You get what I'm trying to lay down. Like Intel will not have a CHID for a Dell device, right? And so that's the no part. The other part of it is, again, I have no time. The CHID is based on like the things like the BIOS and information in the BIOS. Because the same model and hardware, right? Well, that comes from the BIOS. So you can actually screw that part up, right? Because this device has a CHID and it knows what the CHID is. But if you in this room want to find out the CHID, you have to go download the driver hardware development kit and find an EXE and do some like black magic stuff. So it's really hard to figure out what the CHID is for this device. And I'm pretty sure that if you get a new motherboard, you're going to screw that CHID up. And if you have VARs who are helpfully changing model numbers to, and I kid you not, model number. We've had we dealt with a customer in my previous org where we had a customer who every single device, the model number was the string model number. Every serial device, every serial number was not serial number, the string. Now, I haven't tested this to confirm that breaks the CHID, but like I also believe that's probably a bad juju. And yes, you could probably break this system. I haven't tested that yet, so I'm speaking ahead of my experience. But you have to get that right. What's that?
I think for some that we bought, I'd rather have it just say serial number than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yes. So the response is like it's at least serial number is better than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. which I now need to go change my luggage combination. So here's, again, if you get this out, you know, if I had 2 hours to do this, we could show you like the PowerShell to do some of the demo stuff. We'll talk. Let's talk about AutoPatch, because I still have 7 minutes. We can do this. Anyone like looked at AutoPatch yet?
I'm not allowed to use it because I'm an educational customer, so.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, cool. So I saw 2 other hands, like, give me like your like 5 sentence, what's your experience?
Lab only and only scheming about what it could do.
Okay, so you're the investigation experience. Was
Same.
Same deal,
A little
right?
skeptical, but interested to see some more of it.
Okay, so, so what is AutoPatch? Does anybody know where did the lead? Forget it. So AutoPatch came out of the Microsoft Managed Desktop, which is, you know, sort of a, they probably wouldn't like me saying this, but it's sort of an MSP, Microsoft MSP service, right? You pay them, they will manage that desktop for you. So now you got this team building a thing to do patching, right? If you're going to, if you go into the MSP business, you are going to have to manage patches. And so they developed a system to do exactly that. And then they eventually were like, hey, that's a thing we can sell. And so that's what AutoPatch is. So AutoPatch is not, especially when it started, AutoPatch is built on top of everything we've talked about so far. Built on top of Windows Update for Business, the Windows 10 feature. It's built on top of the Windows Update for Business Deployment Service, the API in front of Windows Update. And in fact, my tenant, again, no time to demo, we can come afterwards and I'll show it to you, but like, when you enable AutoPatch, you guys will see this, like, it starts creating rings for you. Like, you know, it's doing all the things you yourself could also do, but it's doing it for you, right? Like, and what it's going to apply, it's going to apply initially what Microsoft has always said. This is what we tell you. Like, we tell you, they have recommendations for how to set these things up. And so they just go set it up for the way that they've always told you should do this. And then they just go do it for you, so that you don't have to. It is now part, so again, it was part of this other org structure, and now it's under Panos, I believe. It's under the larger Windows. So you had these separate org that was building this automation against this other technology over here, and they're now all in the same org structure, and they're talking to each other. There's a built-in reporting, so that was part of the early on thing that got me excited, right? So because for years I've been complaining about the absolute crap update reporting we get in either Intune or anywhere. And so like, I was happy that there's a group of, hey, this is a problem we need to solve. The other thing I get really, I don't know, that's in the next slide. Requirements, so it does need Intune and E3, right? So it is an Intune, you know, it's built on top of Intune. That's where the UI is. I say E3, but that's also all the other A3 and what? No,
It's not A.
Oh, that's right. Sorry. You're right. AutoPatch is not an A.
It's definitely not A.
You're right. Sorry, you're right. This was true. Right. Only E3 or better, and only corporately owned devices. Okay, we do. I do have a slide on it. Great. Okay, so this is sort of, in my mind, AutoPatch's thing. It's a patching with an SLO. It's not an SLA. It's an SLO, which is to say it's a service level objective. So this is their objective. If they don't meet it, I guess that means they didn't meet it. With an SLA, you usually have some kind of consequence. They give you some money, but what are they going to do? Give you E3 back? I don't know. And this question, like, what would it take to get an SLA? It's like, I don't know.
Free services for everybody.
Yeah. An SLA means nothing if you fail to meet it and you don't have to, there's no consequences, right? So I think that's unlikely, but who knows? But this is a SLA, 95% of eligible devices on the latest cumulative update within 21 days of release. Now, Kim, we talked about this, and Kim asked the question, well, anytime you do anything, talk about any number in patching, you have to say of what? That percentage, the number of what? When AutoPatch came out, people were like, oh, that's awesome. How do you get to 95%? How do they do that? That's a struggle, right? We've all struggled to get our patch compliance up to the mid 90s or beyond, right? Like, that's amazing. How do they do that? Well, the easiest way to make a ratio better is by making the denominator lower. And so you just exclude things. And so what do we exclude? Well, we exclude devices basically that can actually successfully apply a patch. So devices have to be at least 6 hours of usage with at least 2 hours of being used. Before I talk about these things, none of this means like it'll stop trying to patch. Okay, none of these things mean like, oh, it just says, oh, I'm out, we're not going to do anything on the device. It's just, they're excluding it from their SLO if it doesn't meet these things. So hey, if the device hasn't been on for at least 6 hours within the 21 days, with at least 2 of those hours being continual use, like it's not part of our SLA because the device isn't on long enough for us to actually patch the thing. So it's not part of our SLA. A device doesn't have to check in with Intune the last 5 days. So if they haven't been on the last 5 days, then guess what? They're not part of our reporting. That's not the part of the 95%. You need more than 1 gigabyte of free space. So if you run out of disk space, you can't patch it. Guess what? That's not part of our denominator. Devices have to have a steady internet connection and be able to access Windows Update endpoints. So shocking, if your device can actually reach Windows Update the cloud service, it's probably not going to get patched to this service. So that too is now excluded. And if you screw up any of those MDM, CSP, or GPO policies, right, if you break it, you bought it. So they it's not part of this list. So that's kind of how they get to the 95%, which is, if it fails to patch, if it fails to patch for any of these reasons, it's not part of the 95%, which is legitimate. Like, these are all, like, I don't blame them for that. Like, all of these things are reason everyone in this room knows, like, yeah, those are things that are break. But that's how they get to 95%. It's not magic. So what and how, this is the part that gets me really excited. This is the thing I was talking about. Oh, 1 minute. Yep. This is the thing that gets me excited about AutoPatch, is that it's the only place in Microsoft where they're actually thinking about all of Microsoft's products updates. And what I mean by that is, as much as I might crap on WSUS, like in 2003, we had one tool from Microsoft that for free patched everything that Microsoft, no, I shouldn't say that, not everything, patched almost every app that Microsoft had updates for, all in one place with reporting and control. All of those things, it was all one thing. And we've fragmented from that a long way. Office was big enough to go create click to run, right? So now they have their own mechanism that's, kind of the middle finger to enterprise done. I know, reporting is difficult. It's just a whole other stream. And then that let teams, they decided from the ground up, no, we're doing a different thing. We're not going to put updates in there. So then Edge now has its own self-updating mechanism, right? So like we've fragmented to the point where there's no Microsoft tool that will actually tell you real compliance in your environment. What I define that is every device by every update in your environment. Where's that report? It doesn't really exist. And even AutoPatch doesn't get you there because servers are still a thing.
Good, I go to 207, by the way.
Go to
207, we'll cut a break in half for you. 7 more minutes.
Oh yeah. So there's a bunch of rings, 407, let's see. There's an enrollment process, right? They didn't hear things, and get us MSP scenarios. So you're going to they're going to do things for you. And so there's a level of communication. So you got to tell them, hey, who do you talk to? They will expedite updates for you. So they need to know who to talk to. As I was saying, when you enroll in AutoPatch, you will see, you'll see it doing things for you. So these are the device names it's going to go create. I'm going to go create your configuration policies that it needs. Like it's going to do all of these things in your Intune tenant for you. It's going to make sure all of those things exist. Here's your 4 rings. Don't have time. I wouldn't even talk about these in particular. The only thing I will call out here is that test is the only one. So these 3, it will kind of automatically generate for you. This test is, you have to put devices in here, right? So because, it is on like the beta channel of Edge, and I think it's on, is it on Insider? Yeah, it'd be like, it is just throwing everything as fast as it can in that ring. So it's not going to automatically put anything in that for you. But if you have those kinds of canaries you want to put into the coal mine, you can use those. Quality updates cadence, there's different ways you can do deadline driven, where you can actually schedule the install. Although, they literally say, this was on, they actually recently updated the docs because I said, this seems kind of forward. If your devices must be updated at a specific date or time, they are not suitable for Windows AutoPatch. I didn't make that up. That was actually on the docs.
That's horrible.
These are notifications, and you can configure those. They get some, just reboot everything, all those things. Let's see. You can so Microsoft will expedite those. So if everyone remembers the recent Outlook issue we had, and some of us were forcing. So AutoPatch went and did that. They did that for you. There's a group at Microsoft, and I've asked them to explain their rationale, to give us more information about how they make the decision. But again, it's an MSP like scenario. Leave me they may not want to say it that way, but it's an MSP-like scenario. They're making a decision on your behalf. Hey, this thing was bad. It's impacting people. We're going to go expedite this for you. You can pause things. They will, same deal for out of band. And out of band is really impacting their customers. They will go make that decision for you and deploy that update. Yeah, there's quality update. So they have ring progressions and they will look at, the telemetry coming back and decide, they may pause for you again. And they say, oh, this is not going well. Let's go ahead and stop that. Yeah, the big data about blue screens and app crashes, all those kinds of things. Feature updates. So right now, today, AutoPatch does the only feature update control it does is make sure you're on the oldest version in support. So, which isn't like, that's not a great story, but that today, that's the problem. I'm not giving any secret. They know that's an issue and they're working on what does feature update deployment look like in AutoPatch? How do we give you the right control? Which is, it's interesting. I don't know control more you needed than what, rollout wings had. Like, tell it what you want to do and it will do it. So right now today, it's just on, currently it was Windows 10, 20H2 if you do nothing. There is a preview option, I think, to go to get to Windows 11. And it also, oddly enough, this surprised me, supports LTSC. Anyone running LTSC and willing to admit it on Microsoft Campus? Yeah, okay, cool.
On
Was
Microsoft.
that a hand up there, Dave, when you scratch your ear?
No, I thought the caveat of on Microsoft campus was kind of interesting.
Well, listen, you're not gonna go to Microsoft and be like, hey, who's running XP? Because I know there's at least one of you in the room. At least one of you. It better not be you.
To justify digital signage, kiosk, and thin claims.
Yeah. Like, is that a question or?
And airline flight control.
Yeah, yeah. Right. I mean, like, it is a legitimate use case. Most of the people, most of the admins
Optimus MS 2.0, right? What was that?
worker types, office, using office, apps. That's most of the deal. You're absolutely right. There are these use cases where LTS is the correct solution. And I kind of just didn't expect it to support it, but I was correct. Today it only does quality updates as well. There's no feature update to portal. It's not yet.
So you can't get into newer version than 20H2 with feature updates.
Not, AutoPatch itself will not do that for you.
Can you combine like WUfB with AutoPatch to get to that newer feature update, or will that completely freak it out?
So, don't have time to demo, but what I said earlier, right, which is, so the other thing, sorry, when you enable AutoPatch for the first time, nothing happens. Because there's I shouldn't say that, sorry. It does a bunch of stuff in your tenant, but nothing happens on the endpoints. You have to go and enroll endpoints into AutoPatch. We'll create an AutoPatch enrollment group, and you have to manually decide who's going to go in that thing. So AutoPatch isn't all or nothing, right? Kind of LTSC, if you're like, oh, I don't want AutoPatch for LTSC or some other part of your business, like you can slice and dice and do those things. Back to your question. But at the same time, you do see the policy that's setting, like there is a feature update policy that AutoPatch creates that sets it to this particular version of Windows 10. And what they're generally telling you is if you go mess with our stuff, we're like, again, you broke it, you bought it. And so what would it work? I'm not here to tell you. Everything else, right? So again, I'm not going to talk about these things but in detail because I don't have time. 1 minute. Like literally, I'm just excited that there's some group thinking about those things. It does have its own reports, but then when I looked at it, I was like, well, it's only quality updates. So again, you have yet another kind of lackluster reporting solution, which hopefully they fix. But again, it's the only part, or the only thing in Microsoft talking about those things and putting them together. And we don't have time with the reports, but I don't consider it part of WUfB anyways. Not yet. Any questions? Sold. All right.